From the Alvin and Rosalie Sarachek studio, PBS Kansas presents Kansas Week.
And then there were two. Which one of these men will end up as Wichita's next top cop? Or will either of them? Plus, abortion, marijuana, transgender athletes, school funding. Just some of the topics these two clashed on as they tried to win your vote this week. But first, contaminated water, dangerous soil. They've known about it for decades, but just now are asking for help. That's what we're talking about right now on Kansas Week. This is Kansas Week, and I'm your host, Pilar Pedraza. Kansans have been asking for it for years. Lawmakers have been fighting over it. Now the president wants some pardons of convictions involving marijuana. However, where do we go from here? Well, that depends in a great extent in Kansas on your state lawmakers. They're set next week to have a meeting to come to some sort of a compromise solution. But in the meantime, as Rebecca Chung of the KSN Capitol Bureau shows us, a lot of cities are looking to Wichita to see how changes work out.
Well, lawmakers will be meeting here at the Capitol in just about a week. They're going to be working out the details of a medical marijuana bill ahead of next year's session. This comes as some cities could soon look to decriminalizing marijuana. As lawmakers in Kansas once again take up a medical marijuana plan, some cities in the state are already taking matters into their own hands. Just this month, the Wichita City Council voted 5-2 to decriminalize marijuana, promising to ramp down prosecutions. It's an option that could also come down the line for the state's capital city.
We have not had any conversations about it as a governing body. We have a new city manager, and I don't know his opinion on it, but I think it's some conversations we'll have.
Spencer Duncan, deputy mayor of Topeka and a city council member, says it will most likely be up to individual board members to bring up the issue. He says he's open to looking at some options while working with law enforcement, but not until 2023. For now, cities are looking at how Wichita's move to decriminalize could play out and whether legal challenges could arise. Marijuana is still illegal in Kansas and at the federal level. Wichita's vote leaves the local police department and district attorney's office to decide whether to arrest and charge people with marijuana possession.
A year from now, we're going to have a lot more data on the state level and from municipalities like Wichita to see what could work in Topeka.
Now, we also reached out to council members in Kansas City, but have not heard back. As for the medical marijuana bill, lawmakers are giving it another go. They're going to be having their first special committee meeting here at the State House on October 12th. For now, reporting at the Capitol, I'm Rebecca Chung.
And joining us this week to break it all down, we have Adam Strunk, managing editor of the Harvey County Now papers, and Brandon Johnson, a Wichita City Councilman who has been involved in this and several other stories that we are going to be talking about, as well as joining us by Zoom, Dr. Michael Smith, a political analyst from Emporia State University. And Michael, I'm going to start with you. You know, from top to bottom, it really seems that marijuana right now is the headline of the week, and yet there is zero consensus.
Well, you're absolutely right. The national political opinion has changed. Most Americans and many Kansans favor legalization, not only of medical marijuana, but even of recreational. A lot of Kansans live on the Missouri border. Missouri has medical marijuana now, and a ballot initiative expected to pass on recreational marijuana this November. So the question is it really a good use of law enforcement resources to prosecute people for possessing small amounts of marijuana, or to even keep that on people's records, or are there more important issues we should be talking about?
And talking about more important issues, here in Wichita, you guys on the city council made the decision to kind of step back a little bit from prosecution of marijuana-related crimes. Have you been hearing from other cities that they're watching, as Rebecca kind of pointed to?
Oh, absolutely. Spoke with a council member in Lawrence who said that the public there is now pushing them to do what we did as a city. I've talked to council members in 2 other cities that are also considering looking at removing marijuana from their municipal code as well.
What do you think is the push for that? Why is it becoming so urgent at this point?
You know, there's so many states legalizing marijuana. Really the push should be federally to take it off a Schedule I drug. It's not as dangerous as many people have said. There are studies that show that it's not as dangerous as some like to say it is. And I think here, at least in Wichita, we know that. And the other problem is the enforcement of it. Most of the numbers, even as we presented ours during the council meeting, more than 50% were people of color. And we don't make up 50% of the population. So again, it continues to be a burden for people of color, and it's just a plant.
And yet there are still a lot of Kansans, Adam, who are very opposed to legalization of any form of marijuana at this point.
Well, it seems most of them are the elected officials. I think that as time goes on, especially the last 10 or 15 years, I mean, we talk about Wichita, it happened with Colorado. Everyone said, well, we need to look at Colorado. And the doom and gloom that was predicted didn't come out of Colorado. The only bad thing that happened in Colorado is their property prices got driven up from people moving there. I think we've seen kind of a shift on conversation, and as time passes, even compared to like people when I was talking 6 or 7 years ago, like I think there's more of a support, obviously for medical marijuana, but even recreational.
Do you have any idea why that shift has happened?
Well, I mean, look at Kansas, right? We sit by Oklahoma, which has a medical law. We sit by Colorado, which has total recreation. We sit by Missouri. Like, anyone who wants to access it has a pretty easy time accessing it. And I think people are starting to see that the widespread use isn't quite as dangerous as we were taught in school.
Yeah. Some very interesting points there. Now, you mentioned the Colorado case, as so many others have, and it came up in a recent debate with the two gubernatorial candidates. One of many issues they looked at as they clashed head-to-head in their second and final meeting, answering questions on everything from abortion to marijuana.
Thank you so much.
Laura Kelly and Derek Schmidt have rarely appeared together taking questions while on the campaign trail, and this is only the second time they've gone head-to-head in a traditional debate. The two leading contenders to be Kansas governor next year more than once taking over the moderator's job, asking each other questions.
Knowing what we know now about what that tax experiment did to our state, including our schools, would you veto it if it came across your desk?
And I have a question for you, Governor. Do you think that America and Kansas are better off today than they were before Joe Biden was elected president?
While they remained civil, they didn't necessarily pull their punches. Schmidt going after Kelly for her repeated efforts to tie him to Governor Sam Brownback.
The governor has an unhealthy obsession with one of her predecessors.
Former New Jersey Governor Chris Christie, in town to support Derek Schmidt on the campaign trail this next week, said that's a legitimate issue in a campaign.
Well, look, I mean, all I know is that if you're a candidate for re-election, and I was one a number of years ago, the only reason you talk about the past is if you don't want to talk about what you've done in office. And I think that that's the point that Derek was making, and I think it's a good one.
I talk about my record all the time. I mean, fully funding the schools, closing the bank of KDOT, reforming the foster care system.
Kelly, meanwhile, striking back over Schmidt's attempts to bring national politics into Kansas.
For my entire time in the Senate and for my entire time in the governor's office, I have stayed focused like a laser on Kansas, not on the federal government.
Now, Michael, as we look at this debate, there wasn't really anything revolutionary that came out of it, but kind of a couple of slight shifts, especially as we saw Derek Schmidt lean more heavily on crime and punishment issues, and Laura Kelly continuing to hit exactly the same stride she's been hitting throughout this campaign.
That's absolutely right. They're both trying to tie each other to somebody else. Laura Kelly wants to tie Derek Schmidt to Sam Brownback, and Derek Schmidt wants to tie Laura Kelly to President Biden. One thing I did notice about Schmidt's comment that was kind of interesting and maybe an issue with the base, he said Joe Biden was elected president. And I agree with that, and all the data agree with that. But many Republicans do not.
Very good point. A lot of folks across Kansas having some issues with that, Adam.
Yeah, but I mean, at the end of the day, they're not going to vote for Laura Kelly because Derek Schmidt said he accepted the election results. Like, so I don't see, I mean, maybe that pushes to the third party candidate, but I don't really see it.
Yeah. As we look at it, though, another issue that kind of came up, as we've seen throughout this race, is that fight between the pocketbook. You know, we always say that voters vote their pocketbook, and the national issues, the national culture war issues that are being brought in. Any thoughts on why those seem to be the two main strands that we're seeing in this race?
Yeah, I mean, you know, when you go to the store and things are a little more expensive, you try to look for why, and there's different narratives out there. But I think the one key thing that really comes back to Governor Kelly, at least, is all of the investment in the state of Kansas that's taken place since she took office. The Commerce Department has actually been fully staffed. It was cut during the former governor's years, and now we're seeing billions of dollars being invested in the state, jobs being created, and opportunities for folks. So it's hard to argue that.
What are you hearing from your readers, Adam?
Harvey County is an interesting place. I wouldn't quite call it purple, but it's more purple than the rest of Kansas. So, I mean, I do talk to a lot of Republicans. I talk to a lot of Democrats. There is some support for Kelly under moderate Republicans. I was looking at some of the polling data where there are people who will likely vote for Chris Kobach for Attorney General who will also vote for Laura Kelly. It's kind of interesting, but yeah, she does seem to have some support with moderate Republicans. But I mean, Derek Schmidt, I was also at the Republican Ice Cream Social in July, and he drew a big crowd, and he had a lot of cheers when he was just hitting on some of those culture issues.
Yeah. And those moderate Republicans, Michael, have really been the voter that Kelly has been aiming for, especially as we look at some of the endorsements she's announced over the last couple of weeks.
You're absolutely right. She's got a long list of former moderate Republicans that have endorsed her. Maybe they still consider themselves moderate Republicans. Moderate Republicans are greatly thinned in numbers in the Kansas legislature. But again, she's really reaching out to that moderate and independent demographic, as you have to win as a Democrat in Kansas. And quite honestly, in my opinion, some of the decisions she's made as governor are pretty conservative too.
All right. Well, we have still a few weeks left, about a week and a half until voting starts. We'll continue to follow that race, of course. Turning to other issues, this one is a problem that's been hurting residents of one Northeast Wichita neighborhood for nearly 50 years. Groundwater and soil contaminated with a known cancer-causing chemical. As KX Jackson Overstreet shows us, the state health department says it has a plan to clean up the problem, but it needs some help.
Around 2,500 people live in a 2.9-mile section of land from the rail yard near I-135 and K-96 south to Murdoch and Grove. It's a place that Ajane Bennett has called home since
1968. Born and raised Wichita, love Wichita.
It's also near a town that's groundwater and soil has been contaminated with trichloroethylene, a known cancer-causing chemical for decades now.
That means I've been exposed to this most of my life.
This possibly happened in the late 70s, early 80s. They discovered it in 1994. They discovered it was the fault of Union Pacific Railroad in 1998.
The Kansas Department of Health and Environment has a plan to clean up the area for good, costing nearly $14 million. But before it proceeds, the KDHE is looking for public input.
They want to know if the public thinks it's good, bad, does it go far enough, or there are other things. So
Bennett says she's happy that the state and city are finally trying to do something, but that this has taken far too long to get fixed.
They have just let this exist as if it was not a problem. And I think that hundreds and maybe even thousands, I would say thousands of people have been affected by this.
City leaders agree with her.
My top priority right now is to make sure everyone in the area is informed that there are some dangers of contamination and they need to know about that.
And a quick note for those of you who live in the area impacted. The KDHE says it wants to hear from you. Public comment is open until October 16th. You can ask questions and submit feedback to the health department through its website until then. For those who don't like the internet, I know we still have a lot of folks out there who aren't necessarily internet savvy. There will also be a public meeting on November 5th from 1 to 3 p.m. at the Boys and Girls Club. And Brandon, you were in that story. Obviously, this is to a certain extent part of your district. How big of a problem is this? How dangerous is this? How concerned should people be?
I think people should be very concerned. Again, late 70s, early 80s, Miss Ajane, that means that when she was a kid is when this spill happened, and they're still being exposed. Early on in the process, you could even get some of these chemicals through air testing. So if you were in a house, a school, an office building, this was in the air that you were breathing. Now the levels have dropped significantly, but they're still nearly 200 times what it should be in the area. So I'm hoping that folks show up to that meeting so they can be informed, ask the questions that they need, and talk to Union Pacific about making sure this gets cleaned up.
Now, have you heard of any cancer clusters coming out of that area or anything like that at this point?
That was one of the first things I asked KDHE. They're starting to look into it, but anecdotally, I've heard from several neighbors who've talked about kidney cancers, people who've passed away from cancers, different health issues, all in that same area.
All right, so definitely some very serious concerns there. And Adam, before the show, you and I were talking about how it's not just Wichita that may have some of these issues. Lots of areas like Newton that have heavy train traffic and have had some contamination problems.
Yeah, there's contamination. I think we have a site that the KDHE is trying to work to clean up. And like my question after this is over is, what is KDHE going to do about it and when? Like, I mean, I wouldn't expect any progress, especially soon. We've had a site that's been there they've known since the 90s for 24. And to be clear, it doesn't have it's not what the issue you're dealing with, but it does hold up downtown development because we have to dig out all the soil. They've got a plan to deal with it, but it's always when we have to do some of the development, then it's back and forth with the railroad, with KDHE on how we're going to get it done. So.
Yeah, definitely much more concerning when we've got the health issues related to it.
And to jump in, like, why is this coming out now? Why wasn't this coming out in like '94 when they found out about it? Have you heard?
No, there's several reports. There was a meeting about this March 1st of 2003, and they had some remediation efforts, but the current solution seems like it's a good one. Should have been back then.
Okay. And Michael, I want to bring you in on this discussion. As we look at issues like this, there always do seem to be these long delays in cleaning up what we know are dangerous spills.
It is a huge problem. Part of it is if the ground is disturbed. It's not a good decision, but it's the easy decision to just leave it alone, because once there's some kind of a development, anybody starts turning over that earth, it can unearth things. And so if you're shorthanded and you just don't have the resources, unfortunately, many times these agencies decide, well, as long as it's just left alone, we're not going to do anything about it. And then the problem's still there for future generations.
And yet leaving it alone, perhaps not an option when you're talking about a neighborhood.
No, not at all. And one of the bigger challenges is how many people have wells. You know, not everybody gets a permit to dig a well. There are at least 3 housing developments I know right now that have well water that they water their lawns with. So, you know, if it comes out in this exposure like that, is that a danger to folks? And we need to make sure that we get answers to that.
All right. Well, definitely something we want to continue following. Meanwhile, another story that we've been following, whose job will it be to enforce the law in Wichita? This week, we learned who the 2 finalists are for the job of Wichita's next top cop after a 6-month search. As Cake's Jackson Overstreet once again shows us, it's a hire city leaders say is important to rebuild trust in the community after the scandal over racist and inappropriate text messages and the department's role in the handling of the Cedric Lofton case.
It's a decision that the city of Wichita needs to get right. Who will be the next police chief? Right now it's down to 2 finalists, Mario Knapp and Joseph Sullivan. It's a decision that Jasmine Rogers will be watching closely.
The city should prioritize finding a chief who is comfortable making uncomfortable decisions.
Rogers is an advocate for youth justice reform and a member of the Cedric Lofton Task Force. Earlier this year, the task force made several recommendations to the city of Wichita and WPD on how to change its policing strategy after the department's role in bringing the 17-year-old to county custody.
When you talk about WPD's overlap in what happened to CJ that night, I think even the officers on scene could have handled their interaction with CJ a lot better.
What happened to Lofton, as well as the city's ongoing review of the culture of WPD and the city manager's office, are situations City Councilman Brandon Johnson wants these candidates to look at closely.
What additional vision do these folks have for where that task force was going and how our police department can be more responsive in a better way to folks in crisis?
Johnson says the council, along with the public, will need to be thorough with its scrutiny of these candidates. He says if neither one of them proves that they should be the one leading WPD,
there is an opportunity to probably go back out and start that search over again. We're looking for the best chief for Wichita.
And the Eagle in the paper Friday morning really taking the city to task, Brandon, over a gag order put in place on the 2 candidates, telling them basically don't do interviews with anybody. The issue of transparency is a big deal.
Yeah, it's always a big deal, and you know I wasn't aware of the gag order until this morning. I believe that's been solved, but my bigger push for transparency is everyone show up on Tuesday at 5:30 at Botanica, ask those candidates questions, just like I did as an activist in the both rounds before we hired Chief Ramsey, and ask them those tough questions. Any chief will have to stand there and answer to the public anyway. And I'm hopeful that people will show up. We're already hearing, you know, folks looking into their backgrounds and resumes and where they came from. We need to have that conversation.
How much of a role did the council play in picking these two finalists?
The council did not play a role. So we hired an organization that went out, you know, tried to solicit folks to apply for the job. They did. There was a committee made up of citizens and groups that tried to whittle it down to the top 5. I believe one of those candidates ended up getting a job somewhere else, so we were left with the top 4, and they whittled it down to 2, and then that is what went out public. And again, Tuesday we have that opportunity, and if the public isn't happy with it, that's part of the process. We'll have to go back out again and see if we can get some more.
Okay. And Michael, as we look at this, you know, transparency, police departments, it's been kind of a growing issue across the state, across the country.
It absolutely has. Police chief is one of those revolving door jobs, especially in the bigger cities, even medium size. It's such a difficult job, and it needs to be done well. And Kansas City, Missouri has gone through multiple police chiefs doing a search right now. And then the issue is the Kansas Open Records Act. Kansas is supposed to have so-called sunshine laws where public meetings are public. The Kansas's Open Records Act are not, their laws aren't all that tough, and they're not all that vigorously enforced.
And certainly something that you and I have run into with the core laws there, and Adam.
Yeah, no, I mean, I appreciate the core laws we have. There's a cost containment bill that is probably going to come next session. Hopefully they pass it. But tied with that, I mean, we don't have a comprehensive law for body cams. Like, taxpayers pay for body cams. They're supposed to protect both the citizens and the police officers. And if it's not an ongoing investigation, we do not have a comprehensive state law that allows you or I to file an open records request to view that. And in a lot of cases, in a lot of these instances, those are important records to see.
Yeah. Yeah, in the Cedric Lofton case, we did see
Yes.
some surveillance video released, but that is actually the exception and not the rule.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. All right. Well, from police to nurses, worn out and underpaid, they can both say it. Just a couple of the reasons some Wichita nurses say they're looking to unionize. As KSN's Craig Andrus explains, this effort involves more than 600 healthcare workers in Wichita.
Well, this petition was filed by the Nurses Organizing Committee of Missouri and Kansas City. On Tuesday, the CEO of Ascension Via Christi said, "We have received notice of the petition and are still evaluating our response to this action." So on Tuesday, I talked to nurses and recruiters who say this could be good for health care. After the height of COVID, some nurses say burnout is real with long hours and a long list of responsibilities. Some are asking if pay for nurses could be better.
You don't just get to work as a nurse. You're wearing several hats at one time, you know.
Cindy's been a nurse 36 years and says a possible union is not just about the money. It's about quality of life and keeping nurses in the field longer, especially after the long hours and staff shortages some experienced during COVID.
We had retired nurses, retired doctors all come back in.
Cindy says many left the field again after the height of COVID, and that includes a lot of nurses.
The union would provide an extra layer of protection.
Nursing recruiter Melissa says nursing shortage is adding to burnout, so a union might make sense.
So how we're supposed to be our residents' advocate, that's what a union could do for nurses, is be that person that is going and fighting for them to these corporations.
The current petition is listed for employees for the Ascension Via Christi St. Francis campus, full-time, regular, part-time, and full-time charge nurses employed by Via Christi. We've reached out to healthcare experts to ask if this would add to healthcare costs or reduce healthcare costs overall. We don't have a good answer to that just yet, but we do know the push for a union is on. Here for you in Wichita, Craig Andrus, KSN News 3.
All right, and I know that for the last 2-3 years since the pandemic started, we've been getting regular emails at the Cake Newsroom from nurses, from families of nurses about the situations they're facing, about the lack of pay. You have a similar hospital up in Newton. Are you kind of hearing some of the same complaints?
I won't speak on complaints I'm getting about Newton Medical Center, but I will say from acquaintances, from people I interview, I think everybody in the healthcare industry is tired. I mean, it's been 2-3 years. You have a lot of people leaving, you have people retiring, you have a shortage, then you have like them trying to make do with what they have, people get spread out. Like, I can see why people are kind of frustrated with working conditions.
Yeah, working conditions in general, not just healthcare. Even we're also seeing the same thing with teachers. We saw Starbucks unionizing not that long ago here in Wichita. And Michael, perhaps a sign of the times, a sign of the workforce shortage, that workers in various industries are thinking, okay, this is a time when we can band together and have a little strength.
Well, that's right. A study from a few years ago indicated that 1 in 4 nurses have been physically assaulted while on the job. There are a lot of problems there and a lot of concerns. And we hear everybody from Starbucks and Amazon and Trader Joe's to nurses to college professors talking about unionizing. Maybe we're entering a new wave of unionization in our economy, which has had a lot fewer workers since the union workers since the late 1970s.
All right, and so as we look at those issues, perhaps more changes to come in the Wichita area. 600 members here at Via Christi pursuing this. They had 800 at a Texas hospital that just last month voted to unionize.
I think that's awesome. I'm a union guy, and I think unions offer great protections for employees, so hopeful to see them be successful.
Yeah, and certainly something we'll continue to watch as we end up, something that doesn't happen too often on the show. We have a couple minutes left.
What?
Right? That never happens here. We're going to ask a question I always love to ask. What stories did we not hit on today that you think we should have talked about? Adam?
Oh, I guess I get to go first.
Yeah, you're my fellow journalist.
I don't know if it's a statewide story, but it's a story that I'm working on that I think people should be aware. I've been working on a story this week to where overseas companies are taking housing listings and they are then setting up entire scam sites, entire scam systems. So people, there's such a housing shortage all across the state, people will quick rent those, they're cheaper, they're happy to get in there, and then at the time comes, like, then there's nothing there and then it's leaving people out. And so I guess the takeaway for that and my reporting is, like, if you are looking and if you are trying to get into something that's too good to be true, probably is, and be sure to do your research, be sure to call and try to speak with a person of the actual company, and don't do wire transfers. So.
All right. Definitely something maybe that folks should check out. That's Harvey County Now. You guys are online. So there's that. Brendan, what about you? What story do you think we should have stuck with?
I think along the lines of marijuana, what is the legislature doing around licensing? And will they price out people of color who've been the ones who've ended up in jail, in prison with that? So, you know, licensing should not push people out.
Okay. And sorry, Michael, I'm going to have to leave you out. We are out of time. Thank you so much for joining us. Stay safe and have a great week.